Hi everyone and welcome back. Today I have a review on the Estee Edit Palette which Kendall Jenner helped to create, and this has only just launched in the UK and it is exclusive to Selfridges. I think it came out on the 26th of May, so it's been out for about a week or two now. So basically the Estee Edit brand is basically a spin-off of Estee Lauder. It's basically more on-trend makeup and kind of aimed at a younger audience. So at the moment the two faces of the brand are Kendall Jenner and Irene Kim. I think this has been out in the States for a couple of months now, and as far as I'm aware it's exclusive to Sephora, whereas over here it's exclusive to Selfridges. So I had to order this online and it took a couple of days to get here. The first thing that kind of did annoy me about that was that the postage for this was £5. Bearing in mind that the palette itself is already £36, which I think for a high-end palette is probably a reasonable price, but it is still a lot of money that you're spending, so I think that the postage should have been free. Or even for standard delivery, £5 is a lot of money, so I wasn't very impressed with that because there was no way that I could get out of paying that charge even if I had ordered more things. The good thing though about the postage was that it did come with tracking, and it did actually say the specific date that I would get the palette, so that was good, so I could keep an eye on it itself. So when it turned up it came in the Selfridges wrapping, and so this is what the palette itself looks like. It's got Kendall's signature on the front, and this is just called the Estee Edit Palette. It doesn't actually have a name other than that, so obviously this is the only palette that they brought out at the moment. For a size comparison, I find that it's basically the same width as my iPhone. This is the 6S, obviously not the same in depth, so just for a comparison that is how big the palette is, so it is quite small. So this is what the palette looks like. First of all, I'm not overly impressed with the packaging. I think it's quite basic. There's nothing, if you saw that in a shop, there's nothing that basically stands out or grabs you. Especially for the price, I think this looks quite basic. It kind of looks like raindrops, or it kind of almost reminds me of bubble wrap as well. And then this blue smudge is basically the Estee Edit logo. And then I have also used this today, so I will get to that in a moment. So this is what the palette itself looks like. So it's got Kendall's signature at the top, which I think they should have actually put on the front just to make it look a bit more interesting. And then you have all of your shadows in here. One thing I will say is that this palette is quite weighty, so it definitely feels substantial. It doesn't feel cheap. Whether or not it's worth the price, so we'll get to in a moment. So another thing about this palette that is quite unique is that you have these two transformer shades that glow under UV light. I will actually be doing a test of that because I haven't actually seen any videos test that yet, and that does seem to be the main selling point of the product itself. Even when I was watching the promotional videos for this, they didn't test this either, so I kind of want to see what that will look like. So again, I will be doing a test of that later on towards the end of the video. And then you have 6 separate eyeshadow pans, but they all have 2 colours in there. The basic selling point of this is that you would put these 2 transformers over these colours and they would glow under UV light. So all of these shadows are either a sparkle finish, a pearl finish or a satin finish. There aren't any mattes, although I must say the satin finishes do seem to be quite matte. They're not overly pigmented, which I will get to in a second. I do think the colours themselves, there is a good variety on offer. However, not all of the colours seem to complement each other. So for example, there's like an orange shade and then there's a purple shade, which if you were to pair together wouldn't look particularly good. And obviously the main idea of a palette is that most of the colours are meant to interchange and be wearable with each other. She also seems to have done quite a lot of dark shades. I know that none of these colours are true black. I think the darkest that you get is a dark grey, but this palette does tend to have quite a lot of dark colours, more so than I think it needs. I think the reason for that is obviously the UV light. I'm assuming that those colours would show up better over darker colours. So I'm going to start swatching this, starting off with the transformer shades. When I first swatched this, I expected these to actually be a cream finish, but they're not, a powder, which was quite surprising because I thought that that sort of feature would need to be a cream product. So these are what the two swatch like. There is a gold and a silver, and they don't swatch amazingly well. They don't look particularly pigmented. However, these colours aren't meant to be worn on their own. They're meant to be worn over the other colours. So I don't know what they will look like when we actually go to swatch them over the other colours under the UV light. So they might not look amazing now, but they might look really good towards the end. And then so starting off with these 2 bronzy colours, these are actually what I'm wearing today. So this is the first one, the lighter shade. This didn't swatch well at all on my brush when I went to use it. I tried to apply this as an all over lid colour and it just didn't have any pigmentation at all. I don't know if you can see there, it barely swatches at all, so I just had to go with this brownie one all over the lid instead. For a £36 palette, I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Some of the formula of these colours, they aren't great at all, which given the price of this palette, you would expect all of these colours to be extremely pigmented and extremely easy to apply, whereas that just isn't the case. So at the moment, from a first impression, I have only used this palette once. I'm not overly impressed. In fact, I am quite disappointed with the quality of the shadows themselves. I think that there's actually a lot better products on the high street that you could spend your money on. These shadows just don't seem to be very pigmented. A lot of the other review videos that I've seen on this also say the same. Now moving on to the two purple colours. Kendall said that she put these in here because purple is her favourite colour, and I must say these two purple shades that she chose, I think she did a really good job. I think they're really pretty shades and they would complement each other well. So that is what they swatch like. These do seem quite pigmented, but they did seem quite dry and chalky, and just swatching them, they don't swatch amazingly well as well. So when you actually swatch these or go to use these colours, you basically just get a dab of colour, and then if you go to like distribute the colour and blend it out, it just doesn't distribute well at all. And now these two dark greys. So the darkest one seems quite pigmented, but even the lighter of the greys doesn't seem that pigmented at all. And again, these don't swatch particularly well. They're not amazingly pigmented. I think that the drugstore is getting quite good for just getting true black colours as well. So overall at the moment, I'm not very impressed with these shadows. So these are the two orange shades. I actually used this lighter one here as a highlight this morning, and I will actually say when you go to apply the shadows, I don't actually like that there's two shadows to a pan, because when I was trying to pick up this as a highlight shade, I kept getting some of the orange, and because I was using quite a big highlight brush, that's something to be mindful of. You will really need to use a small brush with all of these shadows, or turn it lengthwise and use it that way so that you don't accidentally go into the other colour. So these are what these two look like. This orange shade is really pretty, and again the highlight shade, or what I'm assuming is meant to be the highlight shade, it's the lightest of the bunch, barely swatches at all, and even the orange doesn't seem that pigmented. And now the penultimate colours. So these seem to be more on the khaki tone or the dark green side. I definitely think that it's the pale finish of these shadows that doesn't swatch that great. And again, these barely swatch at all. I think that when I do use this palette, I'm going to have to try and apply these shadows wet. I think that's the only way that I'm going to be able to get any use out of this palette. But for the price, you shouldn't have to do that. These shadows should be a lot more pigmented than they are. And then finally, the last colour, which are these dark browns. And so these do seem a lot more pigmented, but again, they're not overly pigmented, and so that is what they swatch like. So that is all of the colours swatched, and I must say I am really disappointed with this palette. It's just, the pigmentation is terrible, and like I've said, the price you pay, these should be amazing quality in my opinion, especially for Estee Lauder. I know that this is basically a spin-off brand, but especially as it's a new release, as far as I'm aware, I think the Estee Edit, I think this is their first release of products. This should be, the quality of this should be a lot better than it is. I have heard really good things about the other products that they offer, but all of the reviews I've seen on this palette just don't seem to be that good. Another thing I will add is that I used this dark brown shadow underneath my lash line today, and the fallout that I got from this was absolutely ridiculous. Just from barely tapping my brush into the powder, just basically the amount of fallout that I got made this shadow almost unusable. I had to be really careful when I did use this, and then again when I went to apply it to my eyes, the amount of fallout I got was just absolutely ridiculous. So first impressions of this palette, I would not recommend it. Again, I'm going to do the UV swatch test to see if that works. Hopefully the UV feature will save this palette, but while that is a good feature of the palette and it's basically its major selling point, you're not going to be wearing this palette under UV light all of the time. So while that is an impressive feature, if that is the only good thing about this palette, I wouldn't recommend it. I also think that these two shadows should have been smaller, the Transformer shades, because I get that you're meant to use them over all of the shadows, but how often are you actually going to wear this palette under UV light? But I am now going to do a UV swatch test under a UV light to see how these colours swatch. So hopefully that will help save the palette, but like I said, just this palette being good under UV light alone doesn't mean it's worth the money. So I'm just going to get to that now. Okay, so just so that you can see that the UV light I'm using works, I've just got a bottle of tonic water here that I'm just going to test the light on, so you can see that this does glow under the UV light. And as you can see from the light itself, they don't actually seem to be glowing under the UV light. It just seems to be the actual general sparkle in the shadow that's being picked up. And again, as you can see from these swatches, these are the first row shadows with the gold transformer colour over the top of them. The actual UV feature doesn't seem to show up either. These just seem to be glowing in the actual general light and not the UV light. So as you can see, the UV feature doesn't actually seem to be working. These shadows just seem to be actually showing up in the light itself rather than the UV. And again, swatched on my hand, you can barely see the shadows. And I also wore these shadows today, so I'm just testing this out on my eye makeup, and as you can see, none of these eyeshadows are glowing. but under UV light it doesn't work. So big disappointment there. The major selling point of the palette doesn't work. So first impressions of this palette, I wouldn't recommend it. I would save your money for something else. The pigmentation is poor. I don't think that the colour choice is particularly amazing. It's basically a very basic neutral palette with a few bright colours thrown in. I think you can basically get a palette like that anywhere. You don't need to go and spend £36. Or if you do, there are a lot better products on the market. I also think that the packaging itself isn't amazing. When you spend £36 on an eyeshadow palette, I kind of want it to look like I've spent £36 on an eyeshadow palette. This looks like I could have just got it off the high street, and I just think that the packaging is just very boring and basic, and there's nothing that they've done to basically make the palette look a bit more exciting. So I'm really disappointed to say that I don't like this palette as a first impression, because I basically bought this because I love Kendall Jenner and I wanted to basically support her. I know that she helped to design this palette. I don't know how much of a say she had in it. So that was my review on the Estee Edit eyeshadow palette which Kendall Jenner helped to create. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.